World War II is not named as such by accident. It was a true world war in which fighting covered a large portion of the globe. From Nigeria in West Africa to Egypt in the northeast, from the River Plate in Argentina and Uruguay to Manchuria in northern China, from Arnhem to the Alps and from Palau to Papua New Guinea, belligerent nations collided in bitter struggles. The world had seen total global war before, but not on this scale. And yet, too often, World War II is distilled down into simpler terms. It's easier for us to get a handle on it this way. It's easier for us to make sense of the carnage in broad strokes. Germany invaded Poland and took over Europe, and then faced disaster in Russia, alongside a collapse in North Africa, and an Allied landing at Normandy brought about the end. At the same time, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and swept across the Pacific before the Allies pushed them back. But the truth is far more complex than this. By ignoring the lesser-known facts of the war, whether aerial, land-based, or naval, we're doing a disservice to the men and women who suffered, struggled, and had their fates sealed in these theaters. We're also missing the bigger pictures, not recognizing the pivotal actions that were won and lost in theaters away from the main action. As a channel linking the Baltic Sea and German ports such as Hamburg to the Atlantic and Arctic Oceans, the importance of the North Sea cannot be overstated. Thousands of wrecked ships and aircraft lie on the seabed here, many of which came from those few years of fierce fighting in the early 1940s. It was through the North Sea that the great battleship Bismarck embarked on its ill-fated journey into the Atlantic. And further north, in the frigid waters of the Arctic, the Battle of the North Cape would be fought as the Allies struggled to keep supply lines open to the besieged Russians in the east. Of course, not all the fighting here was done by battleships and vast pieces of military hardware. Some of the most astonishing actions were carried out on ordinary boats, crewed by seemingly ordinary men running perilous missions back and forth across the North Sea between the United Kingdom and occupied Norway. These boats and these men were part of an operation that served as a life support machine for Norway during the years of occupation. Today, we're going to be telling their story. This is the Shetland bus, one of the lesser-known operations of the war, but one which some believe had a significant impact on its outcome. Way up north, 130 miles beyond Jono, Groats and Dunnet Head on the northernmost points of the mainland, where the North Sea fades into the North Atlantic, the Shetland Islands lie. The most remote reaches of the British Islands, Shetland has been part of Scotland for 5.5 centuries and part of the United Kingdom since the very beginning of the Union. But its own history is far older. The Shetlands were probably first inhabited by the Pictish peoples, and remnants of their settlements remain today, even thousands of years later. Christianity came here from Scotland and Ireland in the 7th and 8th centuries, but the Norseman invasions of the 8th and 9th centuries brought with them different beliefs and traditions that never fully went away, giving the Shetlanders their own tongue of Norn, which remained the first language up here as late as the 18th century. Shetland is part of Britain, but its unique geography and position in history meant it has often stood apart from the rest of the country with its own particular character and identity. But this doesn't mean Shetland remained untouched by Britain's wars. Even before the Union, ships of the Spanish Armada were wrecked here after their disastrous invasion attempt of 1588. In the First World War, some 1,600 men with connections to Shetland were believed to have served in British land forces and many more in the Naval Reserve. But as the dominoes fell in 1939 and 1940 and Hitler's Blitzkrieg swept across Europe, the Shetland Islands and their people would find themselves playing a pivotal role in the conflict. The idea that the United Kingdom stood alone against Hitler in the first years of the war has been greatly mythologized in the decades since. The logistical nightmare of actually invading the British Isles is often forgot about. Hitler actually believed he could knock Britain out of the war without an invasion while pursuing the aims of Lebensraum, living space in the east, as is the fact that Britain really had no choice but to continue their resistance. However, in 1940, it may have seemed like the UK really was the final sovereign nation that could realistically mount a defence. Denmark and Norway were invaded in April, France, Belgium and the Netherlands had all fallen by June, by which time Italy had entered the war on the Axis side. The fascist governments in Spain and Portugal, while refusing to aid Hitler, certainly weren't going to turn against him. With the USA still far, both chronologically and geographically, away from joining the fight, resistance groups like those in Norway must have felt the UK was the only place they could turn to. But from a Norwegian perspective, the UK had already failed once. Britain had planned to invade Norway back in March, occupying the northwestern frontier of the European mainland, but this invasion had been postponed. To his credit, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, who generally gets a pretty bad press in the historical analysis, was in favour of aggressive action by this point, but the military operation never happened. Britain, instead, opted to lay defensive sea mines along the Norwegian coast, ahead of troop landings at Narvik, Bergen, Trondheim and Stavanger. But by now, it was too late. Hitler's invasion was launched before the troop landings could be organised, and the German forces navigated the minefields easily. Detachments of the Norwegian army would hold out for 2 months, but Norway would have fallen by the summer. The next phase of cooperation between Britain and the Norwegian resistance would have to be very different. More decisive, more secretive, and far more effective. It wasn't until December of 1940 that this next phase could truly begin. In the depths of winter, Major Leslie Mitchell headed north under orders from the Secret Intelligence Service, or SIS, and the Special Operations Executive, or SOE, to set up his headquarters on the windswept Shetland Islands. From an unassuming farmhouse at Flemington, Major Mitchell would conduct his operation. Next, a staging post was needed. This is where refugees would be housed and cared for on their arrival to Shetland. For this purpose, Mitchell selected Lunaness, later moving this base to Scalloway, where boats could be more easily repaired and refitted for their next mission. The reason for this relocation was simple. Lunaness did not have a slipway for launching boats, nor did it have a big enough workshop for maintenance work. At Scalloway, the existing William Moore & Son workshop could be used for the missions, and the Prince Olav slipway was constructed. Flemington House would continue to be used as the base of operations, and the crew members were quartered at the nearby Dinnerpore House. The Shetland Bus, a shuttle transporting agents and weaponry from the British Isles to the Norwegian coast and transporting refugees back in the opposite direction, was coming together. Typical military craft were no good for this mission. They wouldn't be permitted to get anywhere near the fortified coast of occupied Norway, and besides, there weren't any to spare. The British armed forces still reeled after the desperate retreat from Dunkirk in May of 1940, and military resources were already stretched. Like at Dunkirk, ordinary fishing vessels would have a huge role to play, but there was a problem here too. British vessels, civilian or otherwise, could not enter Norwegian waters, much less land at her ports. They could disguise the boats, but this was a big risk and could easily be uncovered by an eagle-eyed sentry or an experienced inspector. And then there was the issue of crews. A Norwegian-speaking Scottish crew might be sufficient, but what would happen if they were captured? It wouldn't take long for the Germans' Norwegian collaborators to discover the infiltration. No, it would have to be Norwegian boats crewed by Norwegian sailors that run this mission. The British intelligence services would run the operation from Shetland, but it would be Norwegians who made the crossing. This actually gave the Allies an advantage. These Norwegians knew the treacherous routes across the North Sea. They knew how to deal with the conditions, having cut their teeth on the intimidating waters of Iceland and Greenland. They also knew the coastlines of Norway and could spot German troop movements and new fortifications long before anyone else could. These would be small boats, not more than 50 to 70 feet in length. They could hold up to 10 men, 6 or 8 in the forecastle and 2 in the aft cabin, but there was room for up to 10 tons of small arms and explosives down in the hold. The craft would be completely defenseless on those early missions, released to face the brutality of the ocean and the German patrols without any sort of armor or gun emplacement to protect them. This would change later in the war as metal plating and machine guns were added, giving the vessels and their crews the slimmest chances if the worst was to happen. By 1943, American submarine chaser vessels would enter the fray, providing the necessary security and muscle to keep the missions running as the clandestine operation became increasingly open and aggressive. For those early missions, Mitchell and other SIS and SOE men like David Howarth, who arrived in the summer of 1941, left nothing to chance during their planning. They restricted fishing around the islands, they took command of lighthouses, and they turned the Shetland Islands into a clandestine base of operations for the task ahead of them. But there was the other side to think about too, the Norwegian side, crawling with Nazi occupiers and local collaborator forces under Vidkun Quisling's National Samling Party, such as the Riksherd. These authorities would not allow any boats they considered suspicious to enter Norwegian ports. A permit system was in force, so the vessels of the Shetland bus would need the appropriate clearance before they entered Norway's waters. Through agents hundreds of miles across the North Sea to the east, Mitchell and his men obtained these clearances. But what was all this in aid of? What was the desired outcome for Mitchell and his intelligence agents, or for the men who crewed the boats themselves? This was not a token symbol of resistance, a sign to Hitler that, try as he might, he could not crush the spirits of his adversaries. This was a genuine contribution to winning the war. When Captain August Neyroy piloted his boat from Shetland in the early summer of 1941, heading for Bergen on the first of the Shetlandsjegnen or Shetland gang missions, he and his men were not risking their lives simply because they could. They were on a meaningful and valuable mission. So what sort of timeline are we talking about here? Well, Norway fell to the Germans in 1940 and was not released from the yoke of occupation until May 8, 1945, 6 days after the fall of Berlin. This means a period of 5 years during which Norway suffered real hardships at the hands of the Germans and the collaborationist government. The Shetland bus ran for almost all of this period. Let's take a look at this in more detail. Norway was invaded in April and surrendered in June. The Allies, aware of the strategic importance of Norway with its long Atlantic and Arctic coastline, began to plan their strategy. A counter-invasion was out of the question so soon after Dunkirk, and so more clandestine operations began to take shape. By the end of the year, Mitchell was in Shetland and the Shetland bus began to come together. The Soviet-Nazi non-aggression pact fell apart. Special operations were by now underway in Norway, supported by the fishing boats making the arduous crossing from Shetland. David Howarth would arrive in Shetland in the spring of 1941, and as he recounts in his book, a couple of dozen Norwegian fishermen and merchant seamen had been recruited as civilian volunteers, and 6 fishing boats had been requisitioned. In the early part of 1941, they had made several successful voyages, but by the time I arrived, the increasing daylight had put an end to their operations till the following autumn. It was during the autumn of 1941 that the Shetland bus lost its first craft. The Siglos was attacked by German aircraft on October 28, 1941, and was sunk. A total of 13 craft would be sunk during the 4 years of operation. Missions continued to run throughout 1942 as Norway entered its 3rd year of occupation. In October, mass deportations of Norwegian Jews began. The crews kept munitions and agents flowing into the country and refugees flowing out, but there were other operations too, some of which were far more dramatic and far more aggressive. One of these was the assault on the German battleship Tirpitz in the autumn. The sinking of the Bismarck meant that the Tirpitz was the last of the big German battleships. This made her both an enormous asset for the Kriegsmarine and also a significant target for the Allies. Linking up with the submarine service, the men of the Shetland bus supported an attempt to sink the Tirpitz. This attempt was unsuccessful, but tells us something about the bravery and audacity of the crews, and also about the high regard that other branches of the armed forces held for the Shetland gang. On October 26, 1943, almost 2 years to the day following the sinking of the Sigalus, the Shetland bus received an important boost. After losing significant numbers of ships during 1942 and 1943, it was decided that something more robust was required. Prayers were answered by the arrival of 3 American ships, the Hitra, the Vigra, and the Hessa. These vessels were named after small islands off the Norwegian coast, but actually came from Miami. Packed into shipping containers and dispatched across the Atlantic on merchant vessels, the 3 boats were swiftly reassembled at facilities along the Clyde River on the Scottish mainland and were ready for service only 3 weeks after they were ordered. With the arrival of the 3 American boats, the character of the Shetland bus mission changed significantly. No more vessels were lost, and the days of those unassuming fishing boats pulling off remarkable feats of endurance and courage were over. Still, those later missions owed a huge debt to the tenacity, ingenuity, and heroism of the earlier crews. As Allied power grew in Western Europe in preparation for the invasion at Normandy, and Axis forces were dealt blow after blow in North Africa, Italy, and the Soviet Union, the balance of power was shifting. Norway had, in one sense, become marginalized, away from the carnage unfolding across numerous fronts and from the vice-like squeeze Germany now found herself under. And yet, in other senses, the strategic value of this coastline was never greater. Norway was still a vital asset for both sides, and so the Shetland bus kept running. With the Hitra and Vigra and the Hessa now handling the bulk of the work, the missions had become less secretive. The need to hide, the need to blend in with civilian fishing boats simply wasn't there anymore. As such, the now heavily armoured Shetland bus crews moved confidently across the waves, running 80 missions in the last winter of the war and building upon the excellent foundations laid down by the fishing boat crews of 1941 and 1942. By 1945, Germany's air and naval power was greatly depleted. As the Red Army pushed from the east, and as American, British, and other Allied forces advanced from the west and south, the Norwegian garrison was essentially cut off, clinging on to an occupied territory while the hope of victory faded away. Shetland bus vessels were now operating with near impunity between Scotland and Norway. In the last few months of the war, it was the Shetland gang that controlled the North Sea. That said, Norway remained occupied right up until May of that year, falling only after the Battle of Berlin had concluded hundreds of miles away. The nature of the missions had changed, but they were still vital. As we'll see later on, the actions of the Shetlands gang would prove vital in those final hours of occupation. For British operatives like Mitchell and Howarth, and for their commanders, 1940 brought an awkward situation. They couldn't simply abandon Norway to the occupying Germans, giving up such a valuable strategic asset and turning their backs upon their friends across the North Sea. And yet, at the same time, they could not launch a regular offensive action. An invasion or something similar just wouldn't have been possible. For Norwegians like Captain Neroy and others we'll meet later on, the situation was perhaps even more desperate. Their homeland had fallen and they were almost powerless to do anything about it. Almost. They still had their skill and savvy. They could pilot their boats and they had the courage and fighting spirit required to risk it all. For both sets of men, the Shetland bus represented the best possible option at that point in time. This was a way to keep Norway alive until she could be relieved. This was a way to keep fighting even when all seemed lost. Take a look at a map of Western Europe, and the North Sea is most likely not the first thing that jumps out at you. Your eye is more likely to be drawn further westwards into the sprawling and intimidating stretches of the Atlantic Ocean, reaching from the coasts of Ireland, Portugal across to the Americas and beyond, or maybe further north to the untamable Arctic Ocean around the pole. But this in fact does a disservice to the North Sea. Though tucked between the British Isles in the west and the Scandinavian peninsula to the east, with the line of the Netherlands and Denmark on its southern boundary, this is a considerable body of water, covering 570,000 square kilometers and ranging from only around 15 meters deep at Dogger Bank to 700 meters in the Skagerrak between Denmark and Norway, the North Sea is a formidable and ever-changing environment. Crossing it is not to be taken lightly, even by experienced individuals, especially during wartime. It's also seen more than its fair share of military carnage. Just 25 years before those first vessels took off from Shetland on their crucial mission, the North Sea was the location for the greatest naval battle in history up to that point, when the British and German fleets faced off at the Battle of Jutland in 1916, resulting in almost 10,000 casualties. A century earlier, Admiral James Gambier would lead British naval power through the deepest stretches of the North Sea on the way to smash Copenhagen. 2.5 centuries before that, the Spanish Armada would be savaged by devastating conditions off Britain's northeast coastlines, and earlier still, the pagan Norsemen conducted their raids across the sea, striking terror into the hearts of the early Christian inhabitants of the coastal regions. The North Sea was no stranger to war. The ideal time to make this crossing is in summer, when mild temperatures and low precipitation make northern Scotland and western Norway quite pleasant places to be. The temperature on Shetland averages around 12 degrees Celsius in July and August, and around 4.5 degrees in December and January, while high winds, heavy rain and snowstorms are more likely during the winter. At Narvik, however, one of the northernmost of the Shetland's game objectives, the conditions are even more extreme. Temperatures might drop as low as -11 over the Narvik winter, with bitter winds and heavy snow making life and work a real challenge. Between these 2 points, the winter seas result in desperate conditions for all but the most sturdy of craft and the most steady-handed of crews. The further north you go, the less daylight there is in winter too. In Howarth's book, he described how, at midwinter, the sun did not rise at all north of the Arctic Circle, and there was nothing more than the light of an uneasy dusk for a few hours at midday. Even back in Shetland, the winter light was dim, yellowish, and lasting only from 9 o'clock till 3:30. If all of this sounds like a nightmare, it's probably better to wait till summer before you plan any voyages. But this was just not an option for the men of the Shetland bus. Good conditions for them meant good conditions for the Kriegsmarine too, and this represented, at least in their eyes, a far greater risk. A gentle, fair weather crossing would have made the boats too easy to spot, and this would be disastrous. There was no other option but to go in winter. In his book, David Howarth details a mission to Trana, a small island some 33 nautical miles off the Norwegian coast and home to the nation's oldest fishing village. While considerably south of Narvik, Trana is still in the Arctic, and in fact, the Arctic Circle cuts right through the middle of the islands. Reaching here from Shetland is a desperate prospect for any craft, but especially for one of the 60-foot boats of the Shetland gang. In Howarth's words, the round trip of roughly 1,200 miles was nothing more than a long, tedious voyage with no special risk attached to it, before adding gravely, except that of the weather. The trip would take 9 days, 4.5 out, 4.5 in, and it was unlikely that there would not be at least 1 day of gales during this time. As Howarth said, the boats just had to carry on through them. The crew would sail northeast from Shetland itself, moving closer and closer to the occupied coastline with each passing minute. When the mountaintops became visible starboard, the crew would then fix their position and begin their final approach to Trana. Between Shetland and Trana, the crew was alone. In the event of a problem with the engine or damage to the hull, they'd have to deal with it themselves, as there was no hope of rescue. As Howard said, the long trip somehow gave more emphasis to the emptiness of the sea. Thousands and thousands of miles were added to the distance covered by our boats, and never a ship was sighted. The journey may have been hazardous, but the fact no German ships were spotted on the way would have offered some comfort to the men on board the boat. The crossing shows us exactly why these missions ran in winter. It was simply safer. They might have spent many miserable hours at sea, but at least the men avoided getting blown to smithereens by a German patrol. But the winter crossings were only safer than the alternative. They were not safe. Even away from enemy vessels though, the hazards were very, very real. One mission that took place in early January of 1942 was hit so hard by a series of mishaps and misfortunes that it's a miracle the crew ever made it back. The craft, known as Foya, was skippered by Leif Larsen, one of the top captains in the whole operation. Larsen and his crew were tasked with ferrying an agent carrying a radio transmitter to a location north of Nordfjord. Heavy winds kept the Foya trapped at Shetland for 3 days, but as the gales began to recede, Larsen and his men set sail. They were about halfway into their journey when the engine ground to a halt, the first of the litany of misfortunes that marred this trip. Water had gotten into the fuel tanks, and it took about an hour to put right before they were off again. Not long after this, there was another issue, a hot bearing in the oil pump. The Foya came to a stop again and once again was repaired. A blocked drainage hole was the next issue, and backed up bilge water began pouring into the engine room. A third set of repairs was needed, but now the gale was getting up again and the Foya was in peril. Larsen decided to hoist the sails and get out of there without the use of an engine, but the devastating winds made progress difficult and dangerous. After some time, the crew got the engine up and running again. The sails came down and on she went. Then the engine packed up yet again. The crew attempted to rehoist the sails, but the bitter cold had frozen the salt spray against the rigging, and the solid, frigid mass of sail would not rise. Finally, after 36 hours at sea, the Foya began limping toward the Norwegian coast. But by now, they were seriously delayed. Pushing on now could put the whole mission in jeopardy as the watery light began its creep into the sky. Larsen and his men dropped anchor and opted to wait out the short Arctic winter day. Before they set off again, a rowing boat was sighted out in the water. 2 local fishermen had come out to join them, recognizing the Foya as one of the vessels from the other side, in other words, a resistance boat. This was a worrying breach of security, but the 2 men offered helpful information that would aid the mission. A new German control point was in operation, and they'd have to pass through this to reach their destination. The crew decided on a detour. They'd head south to the island of Keen, where one of the men lived, picking up a motorboat and using this to navigate the control point with greater ease. This detour took them past an earlier drop-off point, and Larsen landed the Foya here to go and check on how the radio operator he'd deposited there was getting on. The radio operator, driven half mad by loneliness after failing to make contact with England, was overjoyed to see his comrades, and he implored Larsen and the crew to take him back to Shetland. The already delayed mission was now stretching on indefinitely. Larsen reluctantly brought the men aboard, and they rigged up a transmitter so he could contact the base back in England and gain permission to leave his post. With no electricity on board, a petrol generator was used for the transmitter, but this made such a racket on the deck that Larsen and his men feared they would be discovered. They moved the generator down into the hold and started it up. Before long, one of the crew felt tired and dizzy and went to lie down, and then another began to suffer the same symptoms, and then a third. Those who still had the strength dragged the stricken men up into fresh air and then desperately checked the first aid manual to see what was going on. Carbon monoxide poisoning. The men were all saved thanks to the quick thinking of the other crew members, but this was very nearly a disaster. The final straw came the following morning. The Keen Islander had arranged for a motorboat to reach them at dawn, but on its arrival, its owner told the men that it damaged the water pump by starting it when it was frozen up. While the engine still worked, the craft wouldn't get far. This is when Larsen and his men finally called time on their mission. They turned back and headed to Shetland with 2 radio operators on board. Such a catalogue of minor issues adding up to something incredibly serious really underlies the nature of these crossings. Even if they weren't stopped by German patrols, the weather and the mechanics of the boats themselves posed huge problems. Still, as Howarth reports, when Larsen and his crew got back to Luna, the only person in a bad temper was the first radio operator, and we did not take his complaints very much to heart. As we examine the operational tactics and technologies of the Shetland bus, it's best to split the operation into 2, pre-October 1943 and post-October 1943. Until October 1943, the Shetland bus missions were run by ordinary fishing vessels, designed to look as inconspicuous as possible. These were relatively small vessels, up to 60 feet long, and they were slow too, capable of around 9 knots. The crews could not confront the Germans head-on, so they moved under the cover of darkness, usually during the winter when the weather was much worse, but evading detection was much easier. Boats would frequently be checked and inspected when they got close to Norwegian ports and harbours, so disguising their cargoes was critical. The crews used crates that were identical to those utilised by Norwegian freight companies, making it a little easier to slip through unnoticed. As the operations went on, however, the diversion tactics grew more sophisticated. David Howarth describes how paint barrels were used to transport weaponry to resistance groups. Weapons were transported in 5-gallon paint drums, which were fitted with a tube extending from the bung to the bottom, which was filled with paint, so that if any inquisitive person removed the bung and dipped in a stick, he would only find paint and not the Sten guns which surrounded the tube. The earliest missions essentially had no way to defend themselves. Crews carried fishing nets and buoys, which would make the boats look like real fishing vessels and could also be used to obscure more suspicious cargoes, but they had no guns or armour. This changed later on. On board the Olaf, for example, gaps in the wheelhouse wall were filled with concrete, while half-inch steel plates were fitted at the bow and stern. These were rudimentary defences, but they could offer some protection against potential attack. To give themselves a way to strike back if they found themselves in a tight spot, crews began to carry Bren guns. On board the Olaf, loopholes were dug into the walls of the wheelhouse, providing a useful firing position. Howarth describes more sophisticated emplacements too, like twin-stripped Lewis machine guns mounted on telescopic stands and hidden with an oil drum. This drum was bolted to the deck and fitted with a removable lid so that crews had access to a devastating weapon at short notice. Despite these innovations, missions continued to be seriously hazardous, and vessels and crew members were lost with alarming regularity. The Hitra, Vigra, and Hesse vessels that arrived in October 1943 were submarine hunters, very different animals to the fishing boats that had gone before them. These craft were 110 feet long, almost double the length of most of the fishing boats, and could hit 22 knots. Even their cruising speed of 17 knots was almost double the top speed of smaller craft. While the fishing boats had run into countless technical difficulties out at sea, often finding themselves isolated and alone on the ocean waves, these 3 craft were more self-sufficient. Each was fitted with 2 generators to power the 42 different electric motors on the craft. Just one of these generators was capable of providing light to the entire town of Scalloway. Howarth describes the luxuries the men found on board. Central heating, an oil-fired galley, refrigerators, ice water fountains, wine lockers, hot and cold showers, electric toasting machines, typewriters, and so on. Even fur-lined coats and boots were provided, and various peculiar hats to add to our motley uniform. The Americans had actually sent their own crews to handle the boats, but these sailors were sorely disappointed. While the boats had changed, it was still imperative that Norwegians run these missions, and so the veteran Shetland's gang and crews took command. As 1943 neared its end, the crews were hard at work, demonstrating their skill and capability on these powerful 2,400 horsepower ships, while the men at Scalloway expanded the harbour, slipway, and workshop to accommodate them. Tactics shifted enormously with the arrival of these 3 vessels. From October 1943 onwards, there were no German attacks on the Hitra, the Vigra, or the Hesse. Aircraft seemed reluctant to attack these agile and formidable units, and even in daylight, the crews operated with near impunity. Norway remained occupied, but the battle for the North Sea, at the very least, appeared to have been won. To get a real idea of what life was like for the crews and agents that ran those missions, we need to hear the stories of the men themselves. Some of these tales are nothing short of remarkable and really underline the perils they faced on a regular basis. The weather was far from the only danger to the men of the Shetland gang. Our first account is a tragic one, and highlights how disaster could strike at any time, sending men, munition, and machine down to the bottom of the ocean without a moment's notice. It was early on a December morning when Burt Grottel aboard the Axel finally received the card he hoped would never be dealt. David Howarth describes how he and his team waited by the radio back in Shetland, expecting a positive signal from their comrade. These signals were routine, a quick message to let the guys back at base know that the mission was complete, that the crew was coming home. The wait might have been routine, but it was still agonizing, especially when the signal was overdue. Finally, the radio blared into life. The crews used ciphers to send coded messages to and from the base on Shetland, and highly sophisticated messages could run back and forwards without detection. This one, however, was decidedly unsophisticated. There were only 5 groups in the cipher, suggesting the sender had been pushed for time as he worked the machine. The first 4 groups gave them Axel's location, around 200 miles to the north. The final group offered a chilling message: send help. What could the men at the base do? It would take more than 24 hours at full steam for their fishing boats to reach the stricken vessel. Howarth and the men reached out to a group of MTBs under the command of the Norwegian Navy. These units were at Lerwick and could reach the site much faster. There were also RAF aircraft in the area, and these were dispatched too. The would-be rescuers arrived at the coordinates in the afternoon, but a desperate search gave way to nothing, and darkness soon began to fall. The night brought with it heavy winds and a deep swell. The Norwegian MTB took damage in the worsening conditions and was forced to retreat. Dejected, the rescuers abandoned their search for the night. The following afternoon, one of the RAF's Catalina planes radioed the base. They'd found the Axel. She was floundering and abandoned, but the crew had bailed out and had been spotted nearby in their escape dinghy. As the Axel slowly slipped below the dark water, Burt and his comrades in the dinghy raised their arms and waved to the Catalina. The men were alive, all was not lost. But in the desperate confusion that followed, tragedy would raise its head again. The Catalina could not find the nearby fishing boat, and so could not do a direct surface level rescue on the spot. Catalinas are themselves seaplanes, but with conditions already bad and growing worse, there was no chance to set her down, not if they wanted to get her back up again. The weather was too rough for any more MTBs to come out and join the hunt. A Royal Navy destroyer was dispatched, but it could not reach the spot till the following morning. Burt and his crew had been outside, exposed to the harshest of winter elements, for another night. The destroyer, supported by Shetland bus boats and a number of RAF planes, scoped out the area for 3 more days, but Burt and the others were never seen again. The coded message remains a mystery. Howarth did not believe it was weather that had stricken the Axel. As he says in his book, she had been through far worse many times. It's possible the Axel was attacked from above by dive bombers or enemy aircraft. It wouldn't be the first time the Axel had been attacked from the air. Around 100 miles off the Norwegian coast, on a mission ferrying 6 passengers out to the Mosjøen district along with supplies, they were raked with fire from a seaplane. Crew and passengers alike took up arms and a massive firefight ensued. The plane struck 5 times, then a 6th, a 7th, and an 8th. The men aboard the Axel returned fire, filling the air with their tracer and lead that must have perturbed the pilot. This went on for a whole hour until the plane retreated and the men rejoiced. The victory was a huge morale boost, but the Axel's time would finally run out. The coded message doesn't tell us anything at all from that fateful December morning, but perhaps the time was just too short, the situation too desperate to encode and transmit anything more complete. Other incidents are even more mysterious. Such was the nature of the mission that crews might as well have been on the moon as just a few hundred miles out on the North Sea. The chance of rescue or assistance would have been about the same. A couple of weeks after the loss of the Axel, hopes began to fade for another vessel, the Sandoy. Over the next few months, crews began to return to Shetland with stories picked up from the residents of Træna and other nearby islands. Stories of an almighty struggle on the far horizon. There were German planes involved, the accounts said, and an Allied ship. As there were no other Allied vessels in the region, Howarth believed this to be the Sandoy. It seems likely that she was obliterated by a German bomb and no trace of her was ever found. By this point, the fire, which you might remember from the ill-fated escapade off Nordfjord, had been taken over by Ole Grottel. Ole was a popular captain who was known for writing lively accounts in the logbook, and he had more than 2 years of experience at sea. When he set off from Shetland for the islands just south of Bergen, all seemed to be fine. The weather was good and the crossing should be easy. But Grotzel and his men never reached Norway. It's possible that the clear weather made it easy for the Germans to pick them off, but there's no way to know for sure. Both the Sandoy and the Axel went down in mysterious circumstances, and some of the details remain unknown. But only the Foyer vanished without a trace. Between them, the Foyer, Axel and Sandoy disasters cost the Shetland gang 24 men of their then total of 60, a devastating blow, as well as 3 craft. The crews of the boats that ran back and forth between Shetland and Norway were not the only ones risking their lives. A thought should be spared for their passengers too, as these people were not sitting idly by, they were carrying out missions of their own. In April 1942, 2 agents landed at Televåg, linking up with local groups who kept them hidden. But when their position was given away by a local collaborator, the Gestapo descended on the town, killing one of the agents but losing 2 of their own men in the process. Giving the Gestapo a bloody nose like this might have been considered a victory, albeit one tinged with tragedy, but the occupying forces weren't going to take this lying down. A few days later, a larger force returned to Televåg and burned the village down to the ground. All men aged between 16 and 60 were sent to the concentration camps, where half of them would perish. This story is memorialized to this day at the village of Televåg and serves as a sobering reminder of just how much was at stake for everyone involved in these missions. Knowing this, Jan Balsrud would have been well aware of the fate that awaited him and the 10 other men who set sail from Shetland on the Bretholm one day in late March if they were captured on the other side. Like so many other missions, this crossing was supposed to be routine. However, again, like with so many other missions, things quickly began to go wrong. Technical difficulties, an unexpected sighting of enemy aircraft and unidentified ships, and the discovery of habitation near the landing site all threw the mission into jeopardy. The next piece of bad luck arrived in the form of out-of-date information. The man they were supposed to meet, a merchant at Toftefjord, had unfortunately passed away in the months since the last report was made, and the man they were now dealing with did not know about their mission and was suspicious of their questions. Making arrangements to land the Bratholm and her crew, Balsrud and his comrade heard something terrifying. The sound of machine gun fire coming in from the sea. The aircraft and unidentified vessels were indeed German, and the Bratholm was trapped in the fjord. Papers were swiftly burned, the vessel scuttled. The men escaping from the ship in a dinghy were raked by machine gun fire, but miraculously none were hit. When the flames aboard the Bratholm reached the munitions in the stores, the vessel exploded with devastating force. The German patrol boat narrowly avoided the blast, but the dinghy was tossed like a child's toy upon the shockwave, and several men were pitched from the boat. A few men managed to make it ashore. One was shot through the head as he staggered out of the freezing water, but the rest pushed on, scrambling up the rocky shore of Toftefjord and escaping into the savage countryside beyond. There was no way back now. The only chance was to cross Lapland and somehow reach the border with neutral Sweden 70 miles away. I shouted to the others to follow me, Balsrud said in his report, but there was no answer. The German patrol boat which had been landed spotted me and opened fire at about 50 yards range. With 1 foot bare and nearly frozen, I ran a little way into cover. I had no chance of getting away from them as I was too worn out, and to get any farther I would have to cross their course. So in the cover of the rocks I drew my pistol and aimed, but it misfired. I tried again, but it had jammed. I pulled out the magazine and took out the first 2 cartridges. Then it worked. I shot the first German, a lieutenant, twice, and he threw his arms up and fell. I hit the second one too, but did not kill him. The other 2 made off. If they had taken cover on the spot instead of running away, I would not have had the chance of getting away. Now, I had to climb the long, steep hillside to try and get out of sight of Toftefjord and over to the other side of the island. When I was halfway up, I felt a sharp pain in my foot. A bullet had taken off most of my big toe. Because of the frost and snow, it didn't bleed much, but this wound made it difficult to run. At last, I got over the top of the hill and into cover again. When I looked back, I saw that the Germans had put ashore what I thought to be between 75 and 100 men. I was in a desperate situation myself, with the Germans after me, and without knowing my way around the district. On the other side of the island, there was less snow, and I ran here and there trying to mislead the Germans. Eventually, I got down to the sea again and went on along the beach. There I left no tracks, but I knew the Germans would get me sooner or later, alive or dead, if I couldn't find some way of deceiving them. Returning to the water, Balsrud knew he must traverse the archipelago of islands to reach the mainland. Swimming 300 yards through icy water, he somehow reached the next island, putting some ground on his pursuers. 2 local children, girls of about 14, took him into their home where his wounds were treated and he desperately tried to get warm. But here he could not stay. He'd have to keep moving. Balsrud was taken by a rowing boat to the nearby island of Ringvassøy, hoping he might be able to continue on to the mainland without delay. There was a possibility I might get a lift that same night to the mainland with the husband of the district midwife on Ringvassøy, so we went to his house on the west side of the island, but unfortunately he had left some hours before. The midwife had some patients upstairs. She was willing to hide me until the next evening, but I did not think it right to stay in a house where there were sick people. I had a good meal and then set off, walking south to make them think I was keeping to the west side of the island, but instead I crossed over to the other side and walked on along the beach till the early morning when I found another house and went in. The people welcomed me in a very friendly way. I was tired out, and as soon as I explained what they should do if anything happened, I went to bed. In the end, it was days before he could make the crossing, and evading capture was becoming increasingly difficult. What's more, his wounded and frostbitten feet were now causing him real problems. On April 2nd, after a 28-hour walk over the mountains to the town of Bjørneskar, Balsrud was on his way, a passenger on a small boat headed for Norway's mainland coast. After resting in a house for a while, Balsrud set off once again, continuing his arduous journey alone. His strength was beginning to fail him, and the terrain was taking its toll. Traversing a precipitous mountainside, Balsrud suffered an accident that could have cost him his life. It was very steep, and suddenly I fell. I do not know how far I fell. When I came to myself again, I found I had lost both my ski sticks and one ski, and the other ski was broken in 3 places. I'd also lost the clothes I was carrying in a rucksack, and worst of all, my food. I'd also received a hard blow on my head and lost my sense of direction. I tried to dig myself down in the snow, but I was too cold, especially in the feet, so I had to keep on walking and hoping for the best. I sank deep in snow at every step. The next day, the 6th of April, the weather was just as bad. Several times I tried to dig myself in, but it was too cold. That evening, I began to hear voices speaking to me. The only thing I remember over the next 2 days is the nightmares I had, in which I met all of my dead companions. In the evening of the 8th, I reached a house and opened the door and fell inside. The man in the house belonged to an illegal organization in the district, and he knew at once who I was and where I came from, so I was in safe hands. He massaged me and made me swallow hot mild and brandy, and I woke to a kind of half-consciousness. My eyes were hurting and I found I was snowblind. He put ointment and bandages on my feet and then got me up to the loft where he made a very comfortable bed for me. I slept there nearly 4 days. Early on the morning of the 12th, I awoke fully and found that I was still nearly blind and could not stand on my feet at all. The owner of the house called himself Hans Jensen, but this I learned later was his cover name. He told me that immediately after I fell in his door, he went out to see where I had come from. The weather had been fine that last day, so he could easily follow my tracks. He said I had come down from the mountains and had been going around in circles in a little wood less than a kilometer from the house. For the last 24 hours, I had not been more than a few kilometers from the house, and sometimes I'd passed within a few yards of it. It was now that Balsrud learned the full extent of what had transpired at Toftefjord. German soldiers and collaborator police units had scoured the area, rounding up anyone they believed to be involved in the operation. They hunted for radio transmitters and other equipment, going from house to house in search of these incriminating devices. And if there was an unexplainable absence in the family, someone who had seemingly disappeared, then that person was deemed to have fled to Sweden, and the whole household was arrested. As for the prisoners from the Brattholm, they were all dead. The last remaining captive had been executed just 3 days after capture, and the mission's main contacts at Tromsø had been arrested too. Everything was falling apart, and Balsrud was the only one left. He remained at an abandoned farm at Lyngenfjord until he could make his own way across the border, but his frostbitten legs and feet were now in such dire condition that the skin had begun to slough from his lower limbs, revealing sepsis beneath. The numbness and paralysis had by now given way to immense pain as his legs decomposed while he lay in agony in his makeshift bed. Through immense strength of will and thanks to the help of resistance groups in the area, Balsrud survived. Unable to walk, he was packed onto a sled by his comrades and began a desperately arduous journey over the mountains towards Sweden. At one point, these comrades were forced to abandon him for several days on a mountaintop, promising to return and continue their journey once conditions improved. It was almost the end of May by the time a Lapp reindeer herder set off for the Swedish border with Balsrud on his sled, and it was 2 further days before they skirted Finland and finally reached the neutral nation. Even at this desperate final hour, everything hung in the balance. The ski patrol spotted the herder and his forlorn cargo leaving Norway and opened fire at the party. Fortunately, they were able to push through unscathed, crossing into Sweden and being met by the local Red Cross, who sent a plane to pick him up. Throughout the summer, Balsrud lay in his hospital bed. All of the toes on his right foot were amputated, as well as most of those on the left. Miraculously, he could still walk, and by autumn, he was back in England, reporting for duty and awaiting his next mission. A truly remarkable man, and an incredible story of tenacity, ingenuity, and survival. Among such a larger-than-life cast of characters, it's difficult to single out individuals. Hundreds of men risked their lives on hundreds of missions, whether as part of the crews themselves or as passengers and soldiers doing their own part in the struggle against occupation and oppression. Many would eventually lose their lives as a result. David Howarth gives a lot of praise to the men he served within his book, but he singles out one in particular as a remarkable character. That man is someone we've already met once before this tale, as the skipper of the luckless Fire, Leif Larsen, a man who, for Howarth, exemplifies the quiet, noble, and dutiful valor of the Shetland gang. Howarth described Larsen as the finest leader of them all. Elected as skipper of his vessel by popular vote, Howarth stated that Larsen did not in fact look the part. He was a stockily built man in his 30s, Howarth said, with china blue eyes, a broken nose, and a wide, humorous mouth. And he had so quiet and modest a manner that it might have taken us a long time to find out his latent powers. But he soon showed astonishing qualities of a rough and ready leadership and perfectly unshakable courage, and a combination of confidence, bravado, and luck, which brought him through one adventure after another that would have broken the nerve of most men. Distrustful of the Norwegian Navy, admiring of the Royal Navy, and fiercely devoted to his comrades on the gang, Larsen would eventually win the Conspicuous Gallantry Medal, the Distinguished Service Medal and Bar, the Distinguished Service Cross, and the Distinguished Service Order, as well as honours from his own nation. A quiet and modest man, in Howarth's words, the mythology and legends that sprung up around Larsen could not easily be verified. He'd fought in Finland, some said, against the Soviets. Others said he'd found the Spanish Civil War several years earlier. Whatever his background, it was clear that Larsen was a man of honour and bravery. There are many stories about Larsen. One finds him as captain of the Nordsjön on a mine-laying mission that was beset by technical issues. Abandoning their boat, Larsson and his men were forced to don plain oilskins and sea boots in an attempt to make it through occupied territory without detection. Aided by nervous locals who provided them with food, some money and maps of the region, Larsson and his men eventually found themselves taking a passenger ferry, then accepting a lift from a stranger, all the while trying to avoid suspicion by acting as naturally as possible. After a taxi ride exhausted almost all of their money, the men found themselves stranded once again. They succeeded in finding themselves a lift, but the driver did not have snow chains on his car wheels and refused to drive them over the mountain. A second driver also refused, so Larsson and his men decided to walk, crossing the mountains in the dark before finding a haystack on the far side they could burrow into and grab some much needed sleep. A final taxi ride, which at one point drove right through the middle of a convoy of some 40 German trucks, brought the exhausted crew to the home of one of their number, Bjornøy. They'd covered 100 miles in 5 days, and now, if they could find a vessel, they could begin their journey back to Shetland. With the Nordsjøen long abandoned, they'd need a different craft, and Bjornøy's father knew of just the thing, the Arthur, which lay anchored close to the shore. There was only one thing they could do: steal the Arthur. As they prepared for the theft, disaster struck. The Gestapo had arrived, hot on the trail of the 5 peculiar men in oilskins and sea boots. They'd have to act fast. Making their way out to where the Arthur was anchored, a droning wail split the evening, an air raid siren. RAF bombers soared overhead and German positions erupted with the crash of explosives and the thudding boom of returning anti-aircraft fire. Amid this cacophony, Larsson and his crew started up the Arthur and slipped out of the harbour into the open sea. It would be another couple of days before they reached Shetland once again, and the men back at base would have been overjoyed to see their comrades again, and perhaps a little surprised to see the struggling Nordsjøen transformed into the shiny new Arthur. Thanks to their quick thinking, their remarkable endurance, and the kindness and hospitality of Norwegian civilians on the other side, Bjornøy, Pletten, Sangolt, Nipen, and their captain Larsson had lived to tell the tale. The remaining 2 members of the Nordsjøen crew, Gjertsen and Merkesdal, had become separated from their crewmates, and the worst was feared. These 2 had their own adventure, however, utilizing a similarly eclectic set of transports to reach the island of Bjuland. Here, they were sheltered by old friends and even made contact with their fiancés who joined them. The 2 couples, along with the well-known resistance organizer, Dagfinn Hugøy, successfully made the journey back to Scotland, arriving to a warm welcome in Lerwick. As we touched on before, this was not some clutch of token operations, a collection of weak jabs at an advancing and seemingly impervious opponent. Instead, this was a systematic movement of personnel, equipment, materials, and support to and from occupied Norway. The name bus is not accidental. The Shetland gang was coming and going with such frequency that it would have felt like a bus service. And so, we can say without hesitation that the impact on the course of the war was huge. Perhaps the most famous act of sabotage and resistance coming out of Norway during the war were the actions of the Telemark around the Rjukan hydroelectric power plant. Here, Nazi occupiers were working on their own atomic bomb project. While Oppenheimer and his colleagues busied themselves in New Mexico, Nazi scientists were hard at work on their own project based on the work of Jean-Frédéric and Irene Joliot-Curie, relatives of Pierre and Marie Curie, on nuclear fission, published in 1939. Their project required heavy water, or deuterium oxide, a form of water produced with a non-typical isotope of hydrogen. It was the Rjukan power plant that would provide this heavy water, and so Allied commandos would have to knock it out. You might have seen the film The Heroes of the Telemark with Kirk Douglas, Richard Harris, and Ulla Jacobson. Even if you haven't, it's likely you've heard something about what went on up here between 1940 and 1944, as Norwegian resistance units and Allied supporters repeatedly tried to knock the production of heavy water offline, actually succeeding after a daring raid in 1943. Rjukan is far inland, and commandos were landed by air rather than by sea, so the contribution of the Shetland bus was relatively small. Small, but not naught. These assaults on the Rjukan hydroelectric plant were not desperate roll the dice, give it a try assaults. They were part of a broader fabric of resistance built on the foundation of a network of brave men and women operating right across the country. In supporting these men and women, and in laying the groundwork for a successful, sustainable, and indefinite resistance operation, the Shetland bus would have been invaluable. Perhaps those commandos at Ryokan weren't hopping off boats like the Freya and the Axel and charging into action, but the Shetland gang was crucial to their efforts all the same. Whether or not the Germans could have produced a genuine nuclear device before the Americans did is up for debate. But if they had done so, this could very easily have altered the course of the war. Norway is sometimes considered a lesser theatre of the war by those more familiar with the fields of France, the islands of Okinawa, or the defence of Stalingrad, but the presence of a nuclear project here made it pivotal. But let's look a little deeper here. The Shetland bus certainly impacted the course of the war due to the general support for a Norwegian resistance network, but what specific impacts can we consider? One of the most dramatic successes was the commando raid on the village of Maløy. While the action saw the death of Captain Martin Linge and a number of the Norwegian commandos serving under him, it succeeded in knocking out the German garrison and enabling a naval occupation of Rhine Harbour in the Lofoten Islands. Supported by boats from the Shetland gang, these commandos pulled off a daring and decisive action against the Germans at Maløy. David Howarth states that he and his men were initially unwilling to get involved in such a raid, lest it throw their normal operations into difficulty, but he says he was personally impressed by the outcome. The occupation of Rhine, on the other hand, was a different matter. In his book, Howarth states that he and the Shetland bus crews were kept in the dark regarding the strategic importance of the harbour, although they supposed it might be a significant objective if the Navy were to devote so much time and effort to bringing it under their control. But they did see firsthand the psychological effect it had on the people of Norway. Rhine, as Howarth writes, is a small fishing village at the extreme end of the Lofoten Islands and well within the Arctic Circle. With enormous icy crags on either side and under cover of darkness and dim light for most of the winter, it was decided that this would be an easy place to defend. And so, a British cruiser and several destroyers advanced on the harbour. They were supported once again by the fishing boats of the Shetland bus. These boats headed southwards from Lofoten to extinguish the navigational lights in the North Sea. This would reduce the speed of any possible response from German vessels or force them out into the open sea and away from the invading fleet. In Howarth's view, the local Norwegian population did not catch on to the nuances of what was unfolding. The Royal Navy had planned a short-term occupation, a probing advance into Axis-held waters. The locals believed they were planning something more long-term, perhaps even forging a bridgehead for an upcoming invasion. It was not to be. In a few days, the Royal Navy ships were gone and bitter disappointment remained in their place, crushing the Norwegian Ramal at an already desperate time. Even worse, there had been real joy in Norway at the arrival of Allied ships. Open, uninhibited joy, not hidden from the occupying forces and from Norwegian collaborators. The reprisals were inevitable and they were brutal. Another attempt at a dramatic victory was orchestrated from Shetland. Supported by Shetland bus boats and Mitchell and Howarth's infrastructure at Luna and Scalloway, an attempt was made to sink the Tirpitz at its anchorage close to Trondheim. The Tirpitz was deemed both vulnerable and a real headache. She was the last of the German battleships following the sinking of Bismarck, and she was keeping Allied vessels tied up in the North Atlantic in case she attempted to make a break for it out into the open ocean. The raid was ultimately unsuccessful and led to the loss of an Allied craft, the Arthur, stolen by Larsen and his men during their escape, and the capture and execution of one of their agents, Evans. This was a war crime that Admiral Dönitz, the then governor of Norway, would eventually be charged with after the war. Perhaps it's these events, the invasion that wasn't to be at Rhine and the failed sinking of the Tirpitz, that have led to the unfair sidelining of this theatre of the war in the decades that have followed. Yes, the Norwegian resistance got their blockbuster in the heroes of the Telemark, but far more historical study and celluloid screen time is given over D-Day, the March to Berlin, Stalingrad, or the Pacific. This is fair enough, I suppose. These stories make for great war epics. The monotony of cheating death on the North Sea waves, running supplies and personnel back and forth from Norway, doesn't have the same Hollywood appeal, but it still feels desperately unfair to the men who are out there doing such hazardous work. These men weren't out there besieging cities or blowing up defenses. Instead, their missions were rather more subtle, about giving Norwegians the tools, the means, and the support to survive. Their successes cannot be measured in major objectives taken or massive victories. So how should we measure the successes of the Shetland bus? Well, we can start by looking at the sheer volume of missions that these guys were running. As we've touched on already, the word bus was appropriate. This was a regular service running back and forth between Shetland and Norway 198 times during the course of the war. This alone would have made the missions a significant thorn in the side of the Germans occupying the nation. But the aim was to be far more than just a thorn in the side. This was a concerted attempt at overcoming occupation and ultimately winning the war, and so the cargoes of the boats were important too. In terms of weaponry, 383 tons of munitions were shipped across to Norway during the bus's operation, providing a valuable lifeline to the resistance groups operating there. To support these resistance groups, the Shetland bus carried a total of 192 agents to Norway. Of these, 60 were radio operators, most of whom successfully set up listening and communications posts, relaying vital information back to Allied High Command. Munitions, radios, and agents certainly carried a symbolic weight. Norway was not in fact alone in her struggle. But they had a practical purpose too. With this support, weaponry, and intelligence, Norwegian resistance forces were able to remain operational throughout occupation, awaiting the perfect moment to strike. On May 7, 1945, that moment came. Aware that the German grip was loosening, and organized, armed, and ready to make their move, Norwegian troops began to appear in population centers across the country, taking control. They accepted the surrender of Germany's enormous Norwegian garrison the following day. As Howarth notes, in Bergen, for example, 3,000 men were under arms, wearing uniforms and carrying Sten guns sent in our fishing boats and sub-chasers from the stores in Galloway. But the bus doesn't go just in a single direction. It comes back too. Agents were relieved from their posts and returned to the United Kingdom. Crews returned to Shetland for rest, recuperation, and refitting their boats, and refugees were shipped to safety. More than 750 Norwegian Jews, many of whom had fled to the Scandinavian country to escape persecution elsewhere, were detained and deported. This was more than a third of the Jewish population before the occupation, with the remainder escaping the country either over land to neutral Sweden or by boat. Only around 25 Jews were estimated to be remaining in Norway when the occupation was ended. There were other persecutions too. As we've touched on earlier in this video, German occupiers and collaborators came down hard on resistance fighters and the people they believed to be assisting them. Entire villages were harried and harassed by enemy forces, and many people were put to death. As such, there were large numbers of Norwegians who were in real danger and who could not be expected to simply wait out the war. The Shetland bus picked up and rescued 373 of these refugees, essentially saving their lives. 73 agents were also picked up and returned to Shetland. The bus was making a real difference, not only bolstering Norwegian defences, but protecting and sheltering those in need too. All of this didn't come without a cost, however. The channels run by the Shetland bus and its crews were fraught with danger, both natural dangers and military ones. In the first 2 years of operation, the bus lost a number of vessels and dozens of men. As many as 44 members of the Shetland gang are believed to have been killed during the crossings or in incidents related to their work. This is a testament to the courage of these men, demonstrating the very real threat they all faced. A fatality rate of more than 40%. A total of just over 100 men crewed these missions from 1941 to 1945. From 1943 onwards, the military vessels provided by the US Navy meant the missions were far less vulnerable, and not a single craft was lost from this point onward. The Allies didn't launch a traditional invasion of Norway. As we know, the Allied return to northwestern Europe occurred on the beaches of Normandy in 1944, not through the fjords of Norway's rugged coastline. But history is not written in such broad strokes. The war in Europe consisted of a network of interconnected events, all of which led to Hitler's downfall. Before the invasion of Normandy, there were disastrous campaigns for the Germans in the Soviet Union and in North Africa. There was the fall of Italy in the south, and the subsequent occupation of Vichy France, stretching the German defences in the west. So where does the Shetland bus fit into this complex historical landscape? For the young historian Harry Lidgley, who was only 14 when he conducted an award-winning piece of the research into the success of the Shetland bus operation, the crews of these vessels played a significant role. He notes that 156,000 troops landed at Normandy on June 6, 1944, facing a defensive force of only 10,000 Germans. The Allies suffered a staggering 12,000 casualties during the landings, with 2,500 men killed. The Germans, meanwhile, suffered somewhere between 4,000 and 9,000 casualties, though exact details are sketchy. The attritional fighting at Normandy was bloody and horrific, particularly at Omaha, where the Americans suffered the most casualties of any of the Allied landing forces that morning. As the battle unfolded for Normandy, thousands more soldiers would be lost on both sides as the Allies struggled to gain a vital foothold, ready for the march eastward toward Germany. All of this you probably know already, but the numbers might surprise you. 156,000 against only 10,000. An amphibious landing like this was always going to be difficult, but you would be forgiven for thinking the German defenders were far more numerous than this. It's certainly the way movies like Saving Private Ryan depict it. Lidgley's argument is this: there were 284,000 Germans deployed in Norway in June 1944. Had Hitler and his commanders felt confident enough in the security of the country to redeploy some of these troops in Normandy, the outcome of the landings could have been very different. Lidgley doesn't go too far into exploring his counterfactual, but he does make a very important point about the strategic value of Norway in that final year of the war. Not everyone will agree with this conclusion. Even without the Shetland bus, it seems unlikely that Hitler would have withdrawn vast numbers of men, leaving Norway vulnerable, and sent them instead to northern France. With Britain to the west, neutral Sweden to the east, and the Soviet Union to the northeast, the German position in Norway was always going to be precarious. If they wanted to hold this territory, they'd have to commit large numbers of men. However, it does seem likely that Hitler would have taken at least some of these divisions and moved them to France had he felt more confident in Norway's security. It's certain that the ongoing Shetland bus missions made this control more difficult and prevented the Germans from bolstering their Normandy and Atlantic Wall defences, even if those reinforcements may have numbered only a few thousand men. This, in Lidgley's view, could have tipped the balance in Germany's favour. Many of the men involved in the operation of the Shetland bus went on to do great things after the war ended. Lifeline would be key to the development of a pioneering, life-saving craft, which he and his crew tested on a voyage between Oslo and the UK in 1953. It became the first foreign-made craft to be approved by the British Department of Transport. David Howarth would become a highly respected author and historian, covering such subjects as the Norman invasion of 1066, Peninsular War, the Greek War of Independence, and of course, his own experiences with the Shetland bus. But regardless of what life brought their way in the years following World War II, it would have been difficult for any of the survivors to forget what they witnessed and what they went through in those years in the early 1940s. To this day, their families remain immensely proud of the sacrifices and successes of these men. The legacy is in some senses a personal one, but it's also much greater than this. Without the Shetlandsgjengen, Norway's experience of occupation and even the outcome of her story may have been somewhat different. Norway still recognises the bravery and tenacity of these men, and up and down the rugged coast, you'll find memorials to their actions and rich stories of their deeds. In Shetland too, there are museums and monuments, ensuring that a crucial and yet so overlooked chapter of the Second World War is not forgotten by the youngest generations and those to come. Don't forget to comment your thoughts below, and as always guys, thank you so much for watching and I hope you learned something new.